It's not hard to find people who compare Dream of the Red Chamber to Romeo and Juliet. And if you know the basic outline of the story, it's not hard to see why. The core of the story features one boy and two girls after all, so it's obviously a love story, right? Of all the misconceptions around Dream of the Red Chamber, I think that this is the one that has the most staying power. Yeah, there is a love tragedy there. Yeah, it is the core of the book, but there's still so much else that's going on. And if you stop and you start asking questions while you read, you'll realize that there's a lot more to this book than you thought. As I film this, I'm currently stuck in the poetry quagmire that is Chapter 5. Well, I knew that this was going to happen, by the way. Chapter 5 is the proving grounds. This is the litmus test of this novel. If you can get through the poetic foreshadowing, you'll be able to finish the book. And of course, if you take the time to actually learn what the poems mean and how they can be interpreted, you'll start to go really deep, and we're about to go deep. There's a pretty odd part early in Chapter 5 that most readers in English skip past. Jia Baoyu starts off the chapter having a disagreement with Lin Daiyu. The wording isn't exactly clear, but it's pretty heavily insinuated that she was upset that he was a little bit too friendly with Shui Baochai. Typical love story stuff, right? Well, just wait. Jia Baoyu apologizes and they make up, for the time being at least. And then the scene shifts. Jia Baoyu goes with his grandmother over to the other branch of the family in the mansion across the street. Jia Baoyu feels tired when he's there and he is given a room to rest in. But he feels really offended by the painting and poetic inscription in that room and demands to go somewhere else. And so Lady Qin, the wife of one of his relatives, takes him over to her room. Now, rightfully, the maids that surround him protested that it wasn't proper, but Lady Qin just laughed them off and took him there anyway. So the maids protested that an uncle shouldn't visit the room of his nephew's wife. Actually, the truth is that Jia Baoyu is actually third cousins with Lady Qin's husband, and yeah, I did the research to figure that out, but it's still something that was clearly improper. Now, there is a painting and a poem in this room as well. The painting is called Crabapple Blossoms in Spring Slumber, and the poem is really interesting. So the first line is Nanhan suo meng yin chun leng, or a tender chill locks away dreams because the spring is cold. And the second line is Fang qi xi ren shi jiu xiang, or a strong fragrance attacks people, it's the scent of wine. You guys are going to start hating me for doing this, but we really need to slow down right here and look closely at these poems. Both of these images are kind of bizarre, and as I've said before, when you find something strange in Dream of the Red Chamber, you really need to dive in and figure out what's going on. Alright, back to that first line. Nenhan suo meng yin chun leng. I'll keep the English translation of this on the screen. Now, the part that should strike you as odd if you speak Chinese or even in English is the end of this, the last two characters, Chunleng, or the spring is cold. Well, spring usually isn't cold, at least not that cold. Now, it's not clear where the setting of the story actually is, if it's in Nanjing in the south or Beijing in the north. But you know, I've lived in both cities, and the spring in both cities really isn't that cold. Maybe it's cold if you're up in the northeast in like Harbin, or if you're in Winnipeg, Canada, or something like that. Anyway, cold spring is a pretty strange image. Yin here means because, it usually means that. Now you've got these two characters, Suo Meng, which means locked dreams. That's a bit easier to understand. And then you've got this part at the beginning. Nun means tender or delicate, but the thing is that it might not be an adjective here. It could be a noun, tender or delicate people, or maybe young people. Classical Chinese will do that to you. Adjectives become nouns, nouns become verbs, verbs become adjectives, and so on. They get mixed up all the time. And the poetry is the worst. You're never quite sure exactly what's going on. Anyway, though I do think a tender chill locks away dreams because the spring is cold is a fine translation, we could change it. Maybe it means that young people are chilled and their dreams are locked because of the cold spring. And then maybe the cold spring could refer to the coldness of, I don't know, the Confucian society that's around them. Sounds like a stretch, right? Well, let's check out the second line. Well, that would be this line. Fang qi xi ren shi jiu xiang, or a strong fragrance attacks people, it's the scent of wine. Now, if you've been paying attention to Dream of the Red Chamber in Chinese, you know by now that Xi Ren is the name of a character. So don't worry too much if you didn't know that. In fact, if you read The Story of the Stone as translated by David Hawkes, you know, the one that all the brilliant academics read, you would miss this entirely. I think that Hawkes mentions the connection in one of the appendixes in one of the volumes, but seriously, who reads that? It doesn't make much sense if you don't read it in Chinese anyway. That's why you need somebody like me to tell you what's going on. That name, Shiren, is actually really unusual. It literally means attack a person, and it's an absolutely bizarre name to give to a girl or a maid. And it turns out that Jia Baoyu gave this name to his personal maid. The name Shiren comes from a poem titled Chunju Shuxi, or Joyful Village Life, by Liu You, a Song Dynasty poet. Now, Liu You was a brilliant scholar who was dismissed from government service for political reasons. He drank a lot of alcohol to wash away his sorrows and regrets and lived in seclusion in his rural hometown. There's actually a really strong sense of political sarcasm and frustration in his poem, though you would really have to understand his story to really see that. But the part that we're interested in is this line, Hua qi xiren zhi jiu nuan, or the scent of flowers assails us, announcing sun and warmth. Shiren's original given name was Hua Rui Zhu, which is about as flowery of a name as you can get. Anyway, after grandmother Jia assigned her to be Jia Baoyu's personal maid, he learned that her surname was Hua, he thought of the Liu You poem, and decided to give her the name Shiren. Now, David Hawkes calls her Aroma, which is the name that most Western scholars use when they write about her. The reason why he gave her this name is because of the numerous times that she's alluded to in the poetry of the book, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. David Hawkes had to do something that involves the scent of flowers because that's the image from the Liu You poem that Cao Shuiqing keeps bringing back up. It's kind of complicated, right? And it doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that you would do for a normal love story, is it? She's not even one of the major two love interests. Anyway, let's go back to our second line again. Fang qi xiren shi jiu xiang. If you compare that line with the line of the Liu You poem, you'll see that they're almost the same. Hua qi in the first line has changed to fang qi. Both of them mean the same thing, the fragrance of flowers. Shiren is the same. Zhi, to know, has been changed to shi, or is. And jiu nuan, a kind of tricky phrase that means to suddenly become warm, has now turned into jiu xiang, or the fragrant scent of wine. It's an interesting textual trick, and it's one that is simply impossible to show in an English translation. But wait, you say, what's the point? What does any of this mean? Isn't this all just a bunch of mumbo-jumbo? Well, not necessarily. Well, first, you have to understand that this poem is a direct contrast to the poem in the room that Jia Baoyu hated. So this was that poem, 世事东明皆水问，人情练达即文章, or clearly understanding the ways of the world is true learning, fully mastering human affairs is true literature. The image conveyed in this poem has nothing to do with emotions or the senses. It's all about being practical, about the ways of the world, and learning and manipulating emotions and stuff like that. The second poem, meanwhile, is all about senses, the smell of wine, the chill of the spring, and dreams that are locked away. And most importantly is that neither of these poems are actually about love. They're about feeling, they're about emotion, they're about all those things that we keep locked up inside. And the only way to understand this is by digging into the parts of the book that most of us tend to skip through. There's this extremely boring and really long section back in chapter 2 where Jia Yucun gives a lecture to his friend Leng Ziqing on the metaphysics of good and evil. And yeah, I just said that it's long and boring because it is. In fact, it was designed to be that way. Now, I'm not a professor or a teacher or whatever. I don't have some sort of huge reputation or anything, so I can say stuff like this. But the fact that it's a slog to get through doesn't mean that it should just be ignored. Jia Yucun describes the universe as consisting of only two elements, righteous energy and evil energy. Sometimes the evil energy comes out of its prison deep in the ravines of the earth. It goes through the sky and mixes together with the righteous energy. When the two mix together, sometimes they are concentrated in a single person. And no matter what kind of family that person was born into, they will be destined to become an eccentric, something that the rest of the world simply can't relate to. That's precisely the contrast that these poems show. The first poem, the one that Jia Baoyu hates, is the practical one. It's all about studying, doing the right thing, and blah blah blah. The second poem, the one that he loves, is the eccentric poem. In fact, Jia Yucun says that those who have both types of energy within them are destined to become lovesick romantics if they're rich. If they're poor scholars, they will become a reclusive sage. And even if they're the poorest of the poor, they will still never allow themselves to become somebody else's servant. Naturally, the first poem is all about servitude. It's about sacrificing your ideals and desires and what's in your heart in favor of what is practical or utilitarian. And the second poem is about sacrificing the practical to let your heart and imagination go wild. Well, that's what this book is really about. It's not really about the love story. It's about letting the poetry of the heart and the yearning of the soul fly freely. And the more that we dig into this, the more obvious that this will become. So just wait, there's a lot more Chinese poetry where this came from.